there are a few percentages that we can use in order to help us find all the other percentages. So first, we want to look at 50%. 50% as a fraction can be written as 50 over 100, and when we simplify that down, that is the same as a half, which means that whenever we're looking for 50% of an amount, we are looking for a half of the amount. So what we can do is we can take that amount and simply divide it by 2 to look for 50% of the amount. 10% can be written as 10 over 100, and we can simplify that and write it as 1 over 10, which means that whenever we're looking for 10% of any amount, we are looking for a tenth of the amount. So what we can do is we can take the amount and divide it by 10 to look for 10% of the amount. Whenever we are looking for 1% of the amount, 1% is simply 1/100th, so we can just find 100th of the amount, and we can do that by taking the amount and dividing it by 100. Finally, when we're looking for 25% of any amount, we have to remember that 25% can be written as 25 over 100, and when we simplify that, we can write that as 1/4 or a quarter. So whenever we're looking for 25%, we are actually looking for a quarter of the amount. So we can simply take the amount and divide it by 4 in order to find 25% of the amount. And a combination of all these percentages that I've just shown you here can be used to find any percentage of an amount that you're looking for. Question 1 says, calculate 15% of 450. So in order to find 15%, we can split up our 15% into 10%, and we can add on to the 10% another 5% to make 15%. So we are first going to find 10% of 450, and in order to do that, as we previously saw, 10% of an amount means we just have to divide the amount by 10. So we are going to divide 450 by 10. We can cancel out the zeros, and this gives us 45. So 10% of 450 is 45. To find 5%, we know that 5% is a half of 10%. We have divided 10 by 2 to get 5, so we can do the same thing. Our 10% was 45, so we can just divide our 45 by 2, and if we divide that, this gives us 22.5. Our 5% of 450 is therefore 22.5. Now, in order to find the combined 15%, we just have to add our 10%, which was 45, plus the 5%, which was 22.5. And this gives us a total of 67.5. So 15% of 450 is 67.5. Number 2 says calculate 60% of 3,000. So to find 60% of any number, we can first find 50% and then find 10% and add that on. So 50% is a half. So to find 50% of 3,000, we can just do 3,000 divided by 2, which gives us 1,500. So 50% is 1,500. In order to find 10%, 10% means we're just dividing by 10. So 10% of 3,000 would be 3,000 divided by 10. We can cancel the zeros out, and that gives us 300. So 10% of 3,000 is 300. And in order to find a total of 60%, we just have to add the 50%, which was 1,500, plus 10%, which was 300, and that gives us 1,800. So our final answer for 60% of 3,000 is 1,800. So number 3 is asking us to find 35% of 560. So in order to find 35%, we can first find 30% and then add that on to 5%. Now, in order to find 30%, we can find 10% of the number, and then we know 30 is 3 lots of 10. So when we found 10%, we can multiply it by 3. And 5% is a half of 10. So what we can do is find 10% and then half it or divide it by 2. So let's first find 10% of 560, which means we're going to do 560 divided by 10. So our zeros cancel out, and that is 56. So in order to find 30%, we are going to do 56 multiplied by 3, and that gives us 168. So we now have 30%, which is 168. And in order to find 5%, we need to halve the 10%, which was 56. So we're going to do 56 divided by 2, and that gives us 28. So 30% is 168, and 5% is 28. So to find 35%, we are going to add that, and that gives us 196. So 35% of 560 is 196. Number 4 says, what is 28% of 840? To find 28%, we are first going to have to look for 20%. We then can look for 5% and then 3%. 20 plus 5 makes 25, and 25 plus 3 makes the 28%. To find the 20%, we first use 10%, and then we know 20 is 2 lots of 10, so we multiply this by 2. We know 5 is a half of 10, so we can find 10%, then divide it by 2 to get 5%. And to find 3%, we can first find 1% and then multiply it by 3. 1 times 3 would give us the 3%. So first, let's begin by finding 10% of 840. So we are just going to divide 840 by 10 to find the 10%, and that gives us 84. So to find 20%, we are just going to multiply 84 times 2, and that gives us 168. So 20% is 168. In order to find the 5%, we use our 10%, which was 84, and 5% is a half of 10, so we are going to divide 84 by 2, and that gives us 42. So 5% of 840 is 42. To find 3%, we first need to look for 1%. So we are going to do 840 divide by 100. The zeros cancel out, and we are dividing 84 by 10. We know that when we divide by 10, the decimal moves 1 space to the left, so this becomes 8.4. And now to find the 3%, we are going to do 8.4, which was our 1%, and we're going to times it by 3. So that gives us 25.2. So we now have our 3%. Our 3% is 25.2. So what we now need to do is just add all of those up in order to get 28%. 168 plus 42 is 210. And 210 plus 25.2 gives us 235.2. So 28% of 840 is therefore 235.2. Number 5 says, calculate 46% of 360. So in order to find 46%, we can first find 40% and then add it on to 6%. To find 40%, we can find 10%, and 10 times 4 is 40, so we can multiply our 10% by 4 to get the 40%. To get 6%, we can find 1% and then multiply it by 6 to get 6%. So let's first start by finding 10% of 360, which means we have to do 360 divided by 10. Our zeros cancel out, and that gives us 36. So to get 40% of 360, we are going to do 36 multiplied by 4, and that gives us 144. So we can write that down there. In order to get our 6%, we first need to find 1%. So 1% of 360 will be 360 divided by 100. Our zeros cancel, and then we have to move the decimal place to the left once. So this will be 3.6. To get 6%, we then have to times 3.6 multiplied by 6. So we can find 36 times 6, which gives us 216. But because 3.6 is 10 times smaller, we also make our answer 10 times smaller. We move the decimal place back once, and that makes it 21.6. So 6% of 360 is 21.6. And in order to find the whole 46%, we can add 144 plus 21.6, and that gives us 165.6. So 46% of 360 is 165.6. Number 6 asks us to find 37% of 180. So we are first going to see how we can split this up. We can first find 30% and add that to 7%. To find 30%, we can first find 10% and then multiply it by 3. And to find 7%, we can find 1% and then multiply it by 7. So first, let's start by finding 10% of 180, which would be 180 divided by 10. The zeros cancel out, and that gives us 18. So to find 30% of 180, we are going to do 18 multiplied by 3. And if we work that out, that gives us 54. To find our 7%, we first have to find 1% of 180, which means we're going to do 180 divided by 100. Again, our zeros cancel out, and then because we're doing 18 divided by 10, that becomes 1.8. And to find 7%, we now multiply our 1.8 times 7. So we can work that out by doing 18 times 7, which gives us 126. So because it is 1.8 and not 18, we can move the decimal place back, which will give us 12.6. So 7% of 180 is 12.6. And to find the full 37%, we could just add that up, and that gives us 66.6. So 37% of 180 is 66.6. So this is a worded problem that says, if 15% of a group of students are in chess club and there are 80 students in total, how many students are in the chess club? So we know that 15% of these students are in chess club and there are 80 students in total. So to find how many students are there in the chess club, we have to find 15% of the 80 students. To do this, we can first find 10% and then add it on to 5% of 80. So to find 10% of 80, we are going to do 80 divided by 10, which gives us 8 because these zeros cancel out. And to get 5%, we are going to half our 8 because 5 is a half of 10. So 8 divided by 2 gives us 4. So that is 5%, which represents 4 students. And if we want to find 15, we just add them up, and that gives us 12. So 15% of 80 is 12, and 12 students are therefore in chess club. This question says, in a school there are 80 teachers. At lunchtime, they all choose to drink either water, orange juice, or squash. If 15% chose water and 25% chose orange juice, how many teachers chose each drink? So we know that there are a total of 80 teachers, and these 80 teachers are choosing one of 3 drinks, either water, orange juice, or squash. We have been given the percentage of teachers that choose water, which is 15%, and 25% chose orange juice. Now we have to find how many teachers choose each drink. So we have to find the number of teachers that chose each of these drinks. And in order to do that, we can first start by looking for the number of teachers that chose water, which is 15% of the 80 teachers. So we can first find 10% of 80 and then 5% and then add it on to find the 15%. So 10% of 80 will just be 80 divided by 10, and that gives us 8. 5% of 80 will just be 8 divided by 2, which gives us 4. So 10% is 8 and 5% is 4. So the total 15% will be 12, which means 12 teachers chose water. We can then look for the teachers who chose orange juice, and that was 25%. So we're going to look for 25% of the 80 teachers. Now 25% is the same as a quarter, so we're looking for a quarter of 80, which means we're just going to do 80 divided by 4, and that gives us 20, which means 20 teachers chose orange juice, so we could fill that into our box for orange juice as well. Now in order to find the teachers that chose squash, we can first find the total number of teachers that chose water and orange juice, so we can add 20 plus our 12. And then whatever answer we get, we can take it away from 80. So we can do 80 take away our 20 plus 12, which is 32. So 80 take away 32 gives us 48, which means 48 teachers chose squash. And now we have the number of teachers that chose each drink. 12 teachers chose water, 20 teachers chose orange juice, and 48 teachers chose squash. So here are a few practice questions that you can try independently, so you can pause the video and have a go, and then come back to see whether you get the same answers. So number 1 says calculate 95% of 240. So to find 90%, we can first find 90% and then add it on to 5%. To find 90%, we can first find 10%, then multiply it by 9. And to find 5%, we can take 10% and then divide it by 2. So 10% of 240 means that we have to do 240 divided by 10, and that gives us 24. So to find 90%, we can do 24 multiplied by 9, and that gives us 216. So that is our 90%. To find 5%, we take our 10%, which was 24, and we divide it by 2, and that gives us 12. So that is our 5%. So in order to find 95%, we take our 90%, which was 216, add it to 5%, which was 12, and that gives us 228. So 95% of 240 is 228. Number 2 says, what is 74% of 400? So to find 74%, we can first find 70% and then add it on to 4%. 70% can be found by first finding 10%, then multiplying it by 7. And for 4%, we can first find 1%, and then multiply it by 4. So to find 10% of 400, we take 400 and divide it by 10. That gives us 40. To find 70%, we take our 10%, which was 40, and then multiply it by 7. And that gives us 280. To find 4%, we first need to find 1. And to find 1%, we take 400 and divide it by 100, which gives us 4. To find 4%, we then take our 1%, which is 4, and then multiply it by 4, and that gives us 16. So to find 74%, we take the 70%, which is 280, and add it on to the 4%, which is 16. So 280 plus 16 gives us 296. So 74% of 400 is 296. Number 3 says in a survey conducted among 200 people, 40% preferred tea, 30% preferred coffee, and the rest preferred neither tea nor coffee. How many people preferred neither tea nor coffee? So first, we need to look for the people that preferred tea and coffee. So we have 40% that preferred tea and 30% that preferred coffee, which gives us a total of 70%. The question is asking us to find how many preferred neither tea nor coffee. So we take 100 because all the people in the survey represent 100%, and we take it away from 70 in order to find how many people like neither tea nor the coffee. That gives us 30%. So we had 200 people in total, and out of the 200 people, 30% preferred neither tea nor coffee. So to find how many people these were, we need to find 30% of 200. And in order to find 30%, we first find 10% and then multiply it by 3. So 10% of 200 means we can take 200 and divide it by 10, and that gives us 20. So to find 30%, we take our 20 and multiply it by 3, which gives us 60. So 60 of the people preferred neither tea nor coffee.